Welcome to Dinner, brought to you by OraSure Technologies. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Testing products provide a simplified collection process, faster results, cost with minimal risk of tampering, and dramatically reduce risk alteration. The oral fluid drug test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing of drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, and opiates. A fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, and clinical setting screening programs, among others. The presentation is approved for 1 credit hour of continuing education for CSAPAs from SAPAC. Further information will be provided at the end of our presentation. Today's titled, How Safe is Your Workplace If You're Not Random Drug Testing? And will be presented by Bill Curran and Stephanie Elder and Carla Mowry from Gallant Background Checks. President and founder of WFC & Associates, a national consulting firm that specializes in drug testing policy development and provides to-date state drug law information. He is the author of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com and the publisher of the e-newsletter State Drug Testing Laws Monthly, a weekly e-news service, Drug Testing in the News. He is author of 10 books on substance abuse issues, including Why Drug Testing. He administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey, now in its 15th year. Gallant Background Checks was founded on September 1st, 2009 by Carla Mowry and Stephanie Elder. They have combined 14-plus years experience in background checks, service industry, and enforcement field. Gallant Background Checks is built on the foundation of a kingdom-minded company and their name, a brave, high-spirited, courageous, and honorable company. Gallant Background Checks works with the Indian County community across the nation, is Caro certified, and chaired with the Tees and Creek tribes. It is an Indian woman-owned business that has received numerous awards, including the 2011 Certified Woman-Owned Business of the Year and 2013 Professional Women of the Year, and they were awarded the 2013 U.S. Chamber of Commerce Blue Ribbon Award, one of only 100 companies nationwide to be so honored. It will now be a pleasure to hear from Bill Curran.
Well, thank you, Jessica. It is a pleasure to be presenting today in another OraSure-hosted webinar. And so to be co-speaking with Carla and Stephanie, I also want to point out that this is something that they informed me of, that I think I slide on it. Let me see if it actually shows up here. They were actually awarded the 2013 U.S. Chamber of Commerce Blue Ribbon Award, one of only 100 companies in the entire country that were honored with that award. So congratulations to Gallant Background Checks for that, and we'll be hearing from Carla and Stephanie just a little bit later in today's presentation. I think it's always interesting when we look at drug testing results, positivity results in particular, and note the number of people, the percentage of people who test positive in a pre-employment screen. And a provider of drug testing policy services, I mean, that's our core business. We're doing them every week, every day we're working on policies. And it's interesting when a client tells me that they just want to do pre-employment testing, that they can just screen out the drug users, then that's their objective. And going by national averages, 5% of job applicant testing, pre-employment screening, come positive. And yet we know that 1 of every 6 full-time employees, according to government statistics, has a substance abuse issue. So obviously, with a lot of companies doing pre-employment testing, and there still being a lot of substance abusers in the workplace, there are people getting past that pre-employment testing process. Random testing is a great way to identify people who need help. It's a great way to deter drug abuse in the workplace, and in some workplace settings, it is proven to be the most effective deterrent to drugs. In my opinion, even though random testing may not be for everybody, it is the key establishing a drug-free workplace. And a lot of statistics out there to support that. We're going to talk a little bit about the magnitude of the problem, just to introduce you to some statistics that have recently come out from the federal government, the impact that the drug abuse has on the workplace, random drug testing in the workplace. We'll talk about state laws as they affect random testing. We'll go through a three-step process to evaluate the return on investment of random drug testing. And then we'll specifically talk about lab-based oral fluid testing as it relates to a random drug testing program. And many of you on the line may know, if you're in the drug testing business or you're an employer that's covered under the DOT regulations, you know that the federal government, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, is in the process of developing regulations that will permit lab-based oral fluid drug testing under federal mandated programs. DOT would then follow suit, as it's indicated, and eventually allow lab-based oral fluid drug testing under the DOT regulations. So there's a lot of buzz right now about lab-based oral fluid testing. It does what SAMHSA is working on is not instant or POCT oral fluid testing, just lab-based oral fluid testing. So there's a lot on that. Every year our company does a survey of the drug testing industry, and lab-based oral fluid testing was one of the hot issues in the survey this year, primarily because we're getting closer and closer to the time when at least the first version of those proposed regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing are going to come out. We're still a couple of years away, I think, from seeing a final version of the regulations, but it's already creating a lot of buzz. 70% of all drug tests, at least 70% of all workplace drug tests in the United States are not under the DOT regulations. When I first got into the business back in the late 80s and especially through the 90s, it was 70–80% of all drug tests were DOT mandated testing. Now that after all these years it's flipped around and the vast majority of drug tests are not DOT mandated. So for most companies, they could be doing lab-based oral fluid testing now if they chose to. It's important to take a look at how it affects the type of testing that you're doing. In this case, today we're going to talk about its effect on random drug testing in particular. But let me set the stage a little bit with some statistics on the magnitude of the drug problem in our country. And I'm going to hit on a few numbers in today's presentation, but I would encourage you to use that link at the bottom of this slide, and you'll have access to these slides after the webinar is over today, so that you can go in and look at the full report that comes out from the federal government. This is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It comes out every year. It's been coming out every year since the 1970s. Used to be known as the National Household Survey on Drug Use. Now it's the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. Nearly 24 million Americans 12 and older admit to being current illicit drug users, meaning that they have used a drug at least one time, illicit drugs, at least one time in the 30 days just prior to being surveyed by the government National Survey on Drug Use and Health. That's 9.2% population 12 and older, almost 10% of Americans 12 and older. The overall rate of current drug use, as you read along on that third bullet, is similar to 2009 and 2011. So that's the good news. The bad news is that from about 2009 forward, we started seeing a significant increase. And so today's rates are significantly higher than they were 10 years ago when it ranged between 8.1 and 8.3%. Now we're over 9%. So the problem got worse over the last decade, and it is continuing to stay at that high level. Marijuana is, of course, and continues to be the number one commonly used illicit drug. Nearly 19 million current users of illicit drugs. 79% of current illicit drug users smoke marijuana, and 2/3 of them only smoke marijuana. I mean, that is their drug of choice. That's all they do, at least by what they'll admit in the survey. That is an indicator to employers who think, well, you know, with all this stuff going on with medical marijuana, and in Colorado and Washington with recreational marijuana laws legalizing pot, I don't think I'm going to test for marijuana. But the problem is that that's the drug that the majority of drug users are using, and the effects of use on workers, especially in safety-sensitive occupations, is still the same. That hasn't changed. So we're still talking about people being under the influence of marijuana, not being able to operate heavy machinery safely, drive cars, maybe count your money or count your customers' money properly, things of that nature. So the idea of not testing for marijuana is essentially saying, I'm going to let the majority of the drug users work for me, because it'll happen. because the majority of drug users are smoking marijuana. And the ones who aren't, 8 million persons were currently drug users of some drug other than marijuana, and a majority of those people actually abusing they were using psychotherapeutic drugs for non-medical purposes. In other words, they were taking prescription drugs, pain relievers, tranquilizers, sedatives, and stimulants, and using them in a way that either they weren't prescribed to be used that way, or perhaps they didn't even have a prescription. They were abusing prescription drugs. And that's a very scary thought. In fact, I think that the next chart shows all the drugs on a bar graph. Now, many years ago when I got into this business, and I've been in the business for a long time, 24, 25 years now, marijuana was always followed by cocaine for years and years and years. But over the last decade, there's been this gradual trend toward the abuse of psychotherapeutic drugs, not prescription drugs. And now you can see that group of drugs together is the number 2 category of drug abuse in our country. Marijuana is still the king, right there on the top of the heap, but right after them, psychotherapeutic drugs way ahead of cocaine, hallucinogens, inhalants, and heroin. So that is an issue that you've got to keep track of. That's why when we talk about are you testing for the right drugs, are you testing for the drugs that people are actually commonly abusing? So this study is really, really helpful in helping to identify drug trends that will affect drug-free workplace programs and drug-free workplace decisions. Now, we know that non-user can hold down a job, but unfortunately, a lot of them can. In that same study, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, we find that 67.9%, almost 68% of the drug users 18 and older were employed either full or part-time. That's a lot. I mean, when you kind of look at the stereotypical drug user, you think of some homeless person sleeping under a bridge, and that's just not the case. The majority of people who admit to being current illicit drug users are actually employed. They have a full or a part-time job. And the percentage of individuals who are unemployed and into being current illicit drug users is even higher. So if you're thinking about not doing pre-employment testing, you really think twice about that, because the people who are applying for jobs, many of them, unfortunately, have drug problems. And so on the one end, you want to screen them as much as possible so that you're not hiring people with those problems and bringing them into your workplace. But then you want to look at the possibility of random testing as a way to avoid the impact that drug use has on the workplace. And this is just sort of a list. You can find this anywhere. This one comes from Drugs in the Workplace from the NDADD website.org website. But there's lots of these numbers or lists out there of the impact that drug abuse has on workers. But essentially, they're less productive, they're less safe, they get their health care benefits more often, and they file more workers' compensation claims than individuals who do not use drugs, who are not substance abusers. And so whatever the list is, we can use the one on the previous slide, you can look at this one, but the truth of the matter is drug abusers in the workplace are people who are costing you more money than those who do not use drugs. And so you want to screen them before they can get onto your payroll. But we know, unfortunately, that pre-employment drug screening does not keep them all out. And that's where random drug testing comes in. Random drug testing implemented in a workplace, whatever rate you're doing it, sends a message to your workers about how serious you or your clients take this issue. And so let's go through some of the points about random drug testing, just to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about random testing. It's a suspicionless form of testing. Okay, so it's not reasonable suspicion or for-cause testing. It's not post-accident testing. It's suspicionless testing. It's not saying, I suspect these 10 people of being drug users, therefore I'm going to randomly select them. They get randomly selected. That's the whole point, so that the workforce, your pool of employees, they don't know when they're going to be selected, and they don't know which employees are going to be selected. It's random. It's right there in the name. But it is not based on suspicion necessarily. You may suspect you have a drug problem in your company, and therefore you want to implement random testing, but you're randomly selecting people on a specific basis. And I'm kind of emphasizing that because I get that question all the time. I suspect, this worker here of using drugs, I'd like to randomly test him. And then I'll explain that we're not talking about random testing in that case. We're talking about reasonable suspicion. And that's an important distinction to make because state drug testing laws make that distinction often between random testing and reasonable suspicion. And one form of testing may be restricted or regulated, or another form is not. And so you have to keep that straight when you're managing or you're helping a company manage their random drug testing program. You don't give advance notice. Everyone in the pool is always subject to being selected. So if somebody's randomly selected in the first quarter of the year, their name goes back into the hat, and they're subject to being randomly selected again. You want to always have that deterrent effect in place. You can limit it to specific groups of people. For example, some states will actually mandate or regulate that random testing can only be applied to workers in safety-sensitive positions. I've got some state charts coming up where I'll give you some examples of that. So testing doesn't have to be applied to your entire workforce, generally speaking. Random selections can occur within a period of time. You may instruct your TPA, or if you're a TPA, you may have a client that tells you, we want to do random selections every month or every quarter or twice a year, but it's selected ahead of time. Not the date, but the frequency of the selection process. And then there's something called the random frequency rate. That's a percentage of your workforce that's to be randomly selected every year for drug testing. By that, I don't mean that 100 workers and you just on a 20% random frequency rate that 20 individual workers are going to be selected. It just means that 20 is the number of random tests that you're going to do in a year because it's 20% of 100. It could be 50% of 1,000 or whatever you want it to be. I'm going to show you some frequency rates here in a second from the federal government. But random frequency rate sometimes is actually dictated by a state law that applies to you. Many times there is no frequency rate that's actually articulated in a state drug testing law. Of course, the federal government actually mandates certain random frequency rates. These are the 2013 random rates for the various modes within DOT. So the first one is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. This is the largest one. These are the truck drivers, for example. And FMCSA requires 50% random frequency rate for drug testing and a 2% random frequency rate for alcohol testing. And that's an important distinction right there, right? You're not going to conduct a random alcohol test on this person every time you do a random drug test because the rates are different. So let's say you have 100 workers, 100 truck drivers. The percent random rate means you're going to do 50 random drug tests and 10 random alcohol tests during the year. Okay? For federal aviation, it's going to be 25%, federal railroad, federal transit, pipe 25%, Coast Guard 25%. But notice with pipeline and Coast Guard, those last two bullets, 25% frequency rate for drug testing, but no random alcohol testing required under those regulations. Okay, different than the other four modes, FEMA and U.S. Coast Guard, no random alcohol testing required. We'll start. And I'm not doing this because this is what we specialize in policies, but your policy, if you're going to go to random drug testing, your policy has to say it. It has to include an explanation of how your random drug testing will work. What is frequency rate? Who apply to? How often will random selections be done? You want to have enough information in there that your employees, if they ever test positive and they try to challenge your program, you want enough information in the policy to be able to prove that you've educated your workforce on exactly what your random drug testing program includes. But not so much information in there that it somehow gives them some clue as to how to game the system. So, for example, you don't want to put in there that you're doing a 25% frequency and you're going to do them all in the month of January, right? Because for the next 11 months of the year, your drug users are going to know that they've got a free pass because you already did all your random tests in the first month of the year. That would be silly. But sometimes you see those types of things. Your policy is the key to your drug-free workplace program, and whether we're talking about random testing, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, or pre-employment, you need to explain exactly how that particular testing method is going to be conducted by your company. And then you want to train your supervisors. The people who are typically managing or responsible for the enforcement of your program, they must know how the random drug testing program is going to be administered. They will be the people on the front line who perhaps are overseeing that program for you. They're not doing the random selection. You want that to be completely random and out of your hands, but they're going to be managing your drug testing program on a day-to-day basis typically. Depends on the kind of company that you have. Employee education, of course, at your workers. There are many state drug testing laws that require that you notify employees when you make a change to your policy. So if you are going to implement random testing as an addition to an existing policy, you may well be in a state that requires notification that you're adding random testing. Same for supervisor training. You may be required to notify your management of that. The procedures of your random testing program, as I really sort of talked about on the first bullet, important to include in your policy. What is the selection process? What's the reporting timeline? What's the frequency rate that you're going to use, etc. Just enough information so that it's clear that you're doing this and it applies to whomever it's going to apply to, and this is how we actually administer the program. And then every policy should talk about what type of drug testing you're doing, whether it's point of collection versus lab-based, how your confirmation testing will work, what the role of the medical review officer is, etc. And then very important, the results reporting process. Again, many drug testing laws will actually regulate how you report a drug test result to a job applicant and to an employee. Can it be verbal? Must it be in writing? Can it be transmitted electronically? What's the time period in which you have to provide that information to the individual? Do you have to then, upon their request, give them specific information from the laboratory about the result, etc.? Any state laws that apply to drug testing generally will apply to random drug testing specifically. Okay? Now, here's some sample language. And let me just put as a disclaimer before I read anything here that this isn't a random testing policy here. This is just some generic language that you could build a random section of a policy around. Okay, so with that disclaimer in mind, quote, all will be subject to random, unannounced drug and alcohol testing. Again, maybe in a state that doesn't allow testing of all employees on a random basis. Employees subject to random testing will have an equal probability of being neutrally selected for testing. That's pretty generic. That's as generic as you can get there, pretty politically correct. The company does not have the right to waive the selection of any employee who has been randomly chosen. Random tests will be unannounced and performed at reasonable intervals throughout the year. Again, you don't want to be specific, right? We're doing all of our random tests in January, or we're doing all random tests in the third month of each quarter. That kind of stuff. You need to be that specific. The selection of employees for random drug and alcohol testing, let me come back to random alcohol testing in a second, will be made by scientifically valid method, such as a random number table or computer-based random number generator that is matched with some type of an employee identification number. It could be Social Security numbers, payroll ID numbers, etc. Now, let me get back to random alcohol testing for a second. As you in the DOT slide, there are 4 modes within DOT that require random alcohol testing, and all 4 of those modes are at 10% frequency rate. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, has determined that random alcohol testing is not permitted in the workplace because of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So random alcohol testing is sort of, most employers get that. There have been some challenges to that, though, and very recently, either early this year or last year, the timing a little bit off in my right now, but U.S. won a major court decision in which EEOC challenged U.S. Steel's random alcohol testing program of safety-sensitive workers during their probationary employment time with the company. And U.S. Steel challenged EEOC and said, under circumstances, these workers should be subject to random alcohol testing. And the court ruled in favor of U.S. Steel. That doesn't give us carte blanche to do random alcohol testing everywhere outside of the DOT regulations, the non-mandated arena. But there are some circumstances where you can do random alcohol testing. I think it's very limited, though. I was at a conference recently speaking, and before I got up to speak, there was another speaker who asked everybody in the audience, and this was a large audience with maybe 250 directors and risk management directors, et cetera. You know, how many of you conduct random alcohol testing? And I was surprised. I mean, probably 2/3 of the people raised their hands. So there are situations, and perhaps many of them were referring to their DOT mandated random alcohol testing, but there are situations where you can do it, but it is somewhat limited. Okay, a little bit of a sidebar on that. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about state laws, because that's a big issue when it comes to random testing, and any form of testing for that matter, to be in compliance with the state laws that apply to you. If you're reading a state drug testing law, specifically to learn about random testing, I always start out by looking for a definition of random testing that may be in that statute. I want to know how that state, if it does, how it defines random drug testing. Look for any restrictions on who can be subject to random testing. Is it limited to workers in safety-sensitive positions? Is there any other type of language in there that would give me a clue that this statute intends to limit random testing to certain workers and certain kinds of occupations? I also look to see if the state law requires a specific random frequency rate. If there's anything in the rest of the policy, say in the confirmation testing requirements or in the MRO requirements, that relate specifically to random drug testing. That's not very often the case, but sometimes you need to look just to be certain. And also look at this, because there are a number of states that have this. If the federal drug testing regulations, the DOT regs specifically, are actually folded in to this state drug testing law, and therefore I'm required to comply with essentially DOT regulations. Now, what I mean by that is that there are some states that on the very specific details of the procedures of drug testing have essentially punted on that issue, and they've adopted, if you will, DOT regulations as their regulations for the procedures of drug testing. And I look at a drug testing law, a state law, to see if there's any clue in there, and sometimes it's very, very specific, it's very obvious, but I look for clues to see if there's anything in this law that would make me think that the drug testing processes must comply with these DOT regulations or the SAMHSA regulations, 49 CFR Part 40, because then I know, at least in this state, I've got to do it that way. Ohio is a good example of a state, now voluntary drug testing law, meaning companies that voluntarily choose to participate in the program and thus qualify for a workers' comp premium discount must follow the regulations of the state. It's voluntary. Outside of those regulations, I don't have to test according to the Ohio law in Ohio. But if I choose to be in that program and I'm going to get the benefits of it, I must test according to the regulations that are in that voluntary law. And a few years ago, they revised their law in Ohio, that voluntary law, to essentially mimic the SAMHSA guidelines, the SAMHSA regulations, I should say, 49 CFR Part 40. And then for anything else in the policy, they may be very specific to testing. Now, here's Montana's definition. An employee manager contract with a third party to establish and administer a random testing process that must include, and here's number 5, a procedure that requires the employer to obtain a signed statement from each employee that confirms that the employee has received a written description of the random selection process. And that requires the employer to maintain the statement in the employee's personnel file. If you're going to do random testing in Montana, and it's just one part, you have to do it this way. You have to have a signed statement from the employee that confirms that they have received a written description of your random selection process. And that's unique to Montana. Now, Montana's law is specifically, the entire law is specifically about safety-sensitive workers. So you also find that and realize that Montana's law is talking about safety-sensitive workers. So now I know it's confined to safety-sensitive workers, and I have to get this signed statement. So I need something in writing that describes my random selection process. Some charts. I'm going to go through 2 or 3 states here. So in Minnesota, are workers will be randomly tested? No. Sensitive workers? Yes. Specifically in Minnesota, random testing is restricted to safety-sensitive workers. And there's a little bit of a definition of what a safety-sensitive worker is in the state of Minnesota. You're going to have a little bit of imagination if you want to try to stretch those boundaries out a little bit. Is there a frequency rate mandated in Minnesota statute? No. Confirm positives required, a positive required? Yes. And verification, not actually mentioned, but obviously always a good idea, especially in more liberal states like Minnesota. Minnesota's drug testing law actually one of the most restrictive drug testing laws of any state in our country. Here's Connecticut. Connecticut also does not allow random testing of all workers. It restricts it to safety-sensitive workers. But let's hop down to the notes. First bullet. The state produces a list of approved, quote-unquote, high-risk or safety-sensitive occupations that an employer may subject to random testing. So in Connecticut, it goes on just simply stating that safety-sensitive workers may be random tested. It actually defines by occupation title safety-sensitive workers can be randomly tested. In Connecticut, you need to know that. That's important. Frequency rated? No. Confirmation of positives required? Yes. MRO verification? Again, no, but always a good idea. Look at that last bullet. Random testing may be conducted as part of an employee assistance program sponsored or authorized by the employer, which the employee voluntarily participates in. So that sounds like a form of follow-up drug testing, right? A worker has come back from some type of drug treatment program, and they're going to be subjected to random selection of them. They're the one in the pool. They're the only one in that particular pool. They're going to be subject to follow-up or random testing over a period of time, 12 months, 24 months, whatever it may be, X number of tests during that period of time. But in this case, it may only be applied to employees who voluntarily participate. Again, something unique about the Connecticut law as it applies to random testing. In Wyoming, may random testing be applied to all workers in Wyoming? Yes. Is it restricted to safety-sensitive workers only? No. Frequency rate mandated? Yes. Confirmation of positives? Yes. MRO verification? Yes. Wyoming, it defers to the federal regs as their procedural regulations. So this is an example of a state, like I described before, that sort of punt on the particulars of the process, of the procedures, and they essentially require employers to follow the federal regs. And there's some other information down there that really, all four of those bullets sort of mimic what you would find in the federal regulations. That's one state in Wyoming. Okay, so let's talk return on investment. In its employers, published by SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, in conjunction with DAISHA, the Drug and Alcohol Testing Industry Association, 16% of employers said they believed that there was a return on investment in random drug testing, and 16% also said they thought random drug testing was too costly. Let's look at some math and see if it's really true. Let's say we're talking about a company with 1,000 employees, and we've got 15% of our workforce as substance abusers. That's 1 in 6, like we talked about at the very beginning. And each substance abuser is costing our company $7,000 a year in absenteeism, in showing up to work late, lost productivity, things of that nature. $7,000, probably lowballing it, but that comes out of a Navy study from the 1990s. So it's a figure that we can go back and point to as a number coming from a source. 15% of 1,000 workers is 150 drug users on my payroll. At $7,000 each, they're costing me just over $1 million a year. Didn't even know that. Now I'm going to conduct random testing at a 20% frequency rate. I'm paying $55 per drug test, maybe a little bit high, but go beyond this, right? 5% of my random tests are going to be positive. That goes back to that study that we cited again towards the beginning. So 20% of 1,000 workers is 200 random drug tests a year. 5% positive rate means I'm going to have 10 workers test positive. They're each costing me $7,000, so that's $70,000 total. I've spent $11,000 on drug testing, right? Random drug testing, but I've saved $70,000. I have a savings ratio of 1 to 7. For every dollar I spend on random testing, I now save my company $7. Now there, I'm thinking, but $7,000 is just a drop in the bucket, right? Because these guys are costing me over $1 million. So can I do better? In the 1980s, the Navy discovered a problem with drugs, implemented a huge random drug testing program, probably the sort of the very first major random drug testing program in any workplace. And a few years later, they conducted a survey of Navy personnel. And in the survey, 83% indicated that drug testing was the #1 deterrent to drug use, and that 27% actually admitted they would resume using drugs if the Navy discontinued its random testing program. Well, we didn't even consider factoring in the people who would be deterred from using drugs. So let's go and redo our math a little bit. We're still doing 20% of 1,000 drug tests. We're still going to get 5% positives, but now 27% of those 200 drug users who work for me are not even use drugs anymore because they've been scared straight, so to speak. Now I've got the 10 who tested positive and the 54 who are deterred from using drugs. I've got 64 employees now that I've either identified or who have been deterred from using drugs. I'm now saving $448,000, $7,000 times 64 workers. I've spent $11,000 on random testing. Remember, that's still the same, but I've now saved $448,000. I've got a 1-to-40 ratio. For every dollar spent, I'm saving just over $40. So to say that random testing doesn't have a great return on investment is an ignorant thing to say. It's somebody who hasn't really looked at the math. And in fact, it actually gets better because in a survey from the federal government, 40% of full-time workers indicated that they would not work for a company that conducts random testing. And percent said they wouldn't even work for a company that conducted pre-employment testing. So there's the value of pre-employment testing. Some people they'll turn around and walk out the door. They won't even apply. But 40% said they wouldn't work for a company that conducted random testing. In other words, advertise the fact that you do random testing. Now let's add our 40% back into the ratio. So we still have the 10 who tested positive. We still have the 54 who said that they would stop using drugs. But now we've got 80 more workers who aren't even going to come to work for me. They're going to turn around and quit once they find out we're doing random testing. So now I've got 104 employees that have been affected. Times $7,000, I'm now saving money. I'm over $1 million. For every dollar I spent, I saved my company $91 on random drug testing. To say that there is no random or no return on investment from random testing is to not look at the whole picture and see the real value. I started out with an obvious saving of $70,000, but I ended up actually calculating over $1 million in savings. Now, I apologize, this chart's a little bit out of whack here, but it shows the positivity rates. DOT tests at the bottom, 1.5% in a major lab, 1.5% positives in 2007, stayed the same in 2011 because DOT testing has proven to work. But, again, it's out of whack, but when I compare non-DOT random testing, my positivity rate is 5.2%. So catching a lot of drug users with a random testing program outside of the DOT regulations. A lot of value there. It deters some people from using drugs, it helps identify people who need help, and it saves you money. Now, lab-based oral fluid testing is a great way to save additional money. I'm a proponent of all drug testing methods, urine hair testing, oral fluid, lab POCT, whatever works best for you. But we are seeing a fairly significant increase in the interest in lab-based oral fluid testing, as I mentioned early on, because of the movement in the federal government to develop regulations on random testing, on lab-based oral fluid testing. It's not urine, which pleases a lot of people who don't like conducting urine drug tests. Even if you're not handling the samples, you find it maybe perhaps invasive, maybe contrary to your corporate culture, etc. It is, of course, subject to drug test cheating. That's very obvious if you go online and you type in drug testing, not just how to pass a drug test, but drug testing. Dozens upon dozens of websites offering products, offering advice, all kinds of tips on how to beat a urine drug test. You will not find that for oral testing. In fact, the best advice I found on any website on how to beat an oral fluid test was avoid taking the test. Literally, that's what the website said. If you're going to be tested for drugs in your workplace with an oral fluid test, you must avoid giving them an oral fluid sample or a sample of your saliva. One thing about oral fluid testing is it reduces the time that it takes to conduct a test. Because the collection process doesn't involve urine, doesn't involve securing restrooms, doesn't involve all the precautions typical to urine testing, you can actually have employees who are trained to oversee the collection of a saliva sample, an oral fluid sample, and it's sent off to a lab with the chain of custody paperwork in place, with the overnight shipment to the laboratory, result within 24 hours, just like with lab-based urine testing, except you don't have to send workers off-site now to professional collection facilities and the time that it takes to do that. In this same conference that I was in a couple of days ago, we asked how long are your employees gone when they take a drug test? And everybody, not one single hand went up for under an hour. Every hand went up for over an hour. So it's at least an hour, sometimes longer, an hour and a half, 2 hours. With oral fluid testing, you're talking about 10 to 15 minutes, however long it takes to walk from your work site over to where your supervisor is administering that test, and then to walk back to it. And that's how long it takes to participate. So oral fluid testing in a laboratory, very accurate. The scientific process is very similar to that of urine testing and has been legally defended in many instances. There are a lot of different ways to do oral fluid testing, but lab-based oral fluid testing, to me anyways, makes a lot of sense. Again, I'm a fan of all kinds of drug testing. It's not really picking the one that's best for you. It's picking the best one. It's picking the one that's best for you. But if you're looking to save money, to cut the time that it takes to conduct a drug test, then fluid testing probably is a good match for you. Now, if we're talking about random testing, remember, you're calling a worker randomly off of the job, wherever they may be in the assembly line or in the construction site or at the store where your employees work. You're bringing them off the job to participate or to void a sample. If they're in, you're probably going to send them to an off-site collection site. But if it's oral fluid, they can stay right there in the workplace. They've been randomly selected. You want them to come in as soon as possible. Without having to leave the work site, you can do it right then and there. And that random selection has taken place within minutes. You have a sample ready and packaged and able to be sent to a laboratory. The advanced oral fluid testing in the collection process, I think, I've sort of illuminated that already. Gender collection issues go away. The collections go away. Observed collections every time from start to finish. The collection process, not embarrassing for the donor. You're not asking any awkward or untoward questions, not accusing them of anything, because it's very possible on an oral fluid test. And a lot of people consider the yuck factor. They just don't like dealing with urine. If that's the case, if adulteration or drug test cheating is an issue to you, then lab-based oral fluid testing may work well for you, especially in a random drug testing program. Companies that might consider oral fluid testing are those that have never done testing in the past because it just didn't work for them. Urine testing just didn't fit with their corporate culture, with the type of workplaces that they had. Maybe now they're in a position where they have to justify the expense of every program, and so this makes more sense to them. Or it just doesn't work to use conventional off-site collection facilities. Maybe you're working shifts around the clock 24 hours a day, and to send somebody to a collection site at 2 in the morning is just going to happen. And to bring somebody into your workplace at 2 in the morning is extremely costly. So certain industries and certain workplace situations that it really makes a lot of sense to do it this way. Now, that's hearing me say it, okay? I'm actually somebody who sells and manages drug testing programs. So what I'd like to do now is bring in my co-presenters from Gallant Background Checks. I've got Stephanie Elder and Carla Mowry, and they've actually implemented oral fluid testing with a number of clients that are doing random testing also. And I was talking to them earlier today. They've got some great information to share. So let me turn the microphone over, so to speak, the virtual microphone, over to Carla and Stephanie.
Thank you, Bill. I'm Carla Mowry with Gallant Background Checks, and first I want to thank you, Bill, for letting us co-host the webinar, and especially to OraSure Technologies. We are very blessed to be able to be one of their third-party administrators, and I can tell you in the very beginning, when we were looking for a reliable, accurate drug test to use for our company, we wanted the best out there. And we were so pleased to come across them and learn of this oral intercept device. and have implemented it. So we were able to really streamline our process with the background screening checks that we were already doing for our clients. But now we could bring in a wonderful, different option besides urine testing to the clients that were using our service. We have had so much success with the oral fluid based collection. We have one of the largest tribes that have implemented their oral fluid drug testing in all of their casinos, and they love it. It is a gender-friendly, very accurate test. One of the biggest compliments we hear about it is it does save money. A lot of our clients were paying employees to go to a lab. They were getting loss of production. The employees may be gone 2 or 3 hours, depends on how busy a lab is. It depends on what that employee was doing between the workplace and the lab. They could have been there 30 minutes and decided to go shopping and say, well, the lab was backed up. They were coming back with diluted samples. They would have to retest, which in turn, you're paying for a whole new test. When we came up with another option for them of how can you decrease that loss of production? How can you decrease, all this money that you're spending on having to redo tests because of this urine testing, and that comes back diluted because I can say with the experiences our clients have had, the employees, they know the system inside and out. If they are a drug user, they're going to know how to get around a test. They're going to know what to say, what to put in the urine. We had a particular client who knew an employee was using, but every time they sent him to the lab, even if they did a random test on him, it was coming back negative. When we approached them with this issue, we sat down with them, we showed them the product. This employee had quit before they implemented the oral fluid drug test, but they did ask him, how did you pass this? How did you keep coming up negative? And he told them he strapped urine to his leg and would wear it every day to work. He knew the temperature it needed to be at. Now, since they implemented the oral fluid drug test, they have not had one that was diluted. It stopped that problem right there. They could observe the collection, where when you have a lab that an employee that goes to a lab, it's not observed, so you don't know what they're doing. And it really cut out a lot of the time.
I'm Stephanie, and I wanted to add to what Carla was saying in regards to that company. When we first approached them about the oral drug testing, they were very hesitant because they didn't want to do random tests. They were afraid that they wouldn't have any employees left. So we helped them with their drug workplace program so that all the employees knew that they would, anytime they could have a random test. So them implementing the oral drug test, they have people that they can rely on that come to work. They've gone through the people that were doing the drugs, because now they have to answer to somebody, and know that they can't go and get their test results changed or cheat on a test. So it has really helped their workforce, the safety, because it's an industry that they work with heavy equipment and they build things and they're out in the field. They work in the oil industry. So it is a test. If you implement it and you do all the right things along with it, you can have a very safe environment for your employees.
Yes, definitely, and we've also helped people that have switched over to the oral fluid. We have had some employees that did contest it, and I can tell you that 100% when it was contested and the test was redone, 100% came back, it was still positive. So this shows and proves that with the oral fluid drug test that we provide, it cannot be diluted. It is going to be accurate 100% of the time, and that's what I really like about the device. It's friendly, takes 5 minutes. There's no loss of production. Even one of the largest Indian tribes that we have, their tribal council has also passed that all of them have to be subject to random testing with the oral fluid. So it made it equal across the board. Not just the employees are doing it, but their tribal council. And we have a lot of other tribes that are looking at implementing that process. Not that urine testing is bad. It is a great test. It's just this really cuts out a lot of the gender problems, especially with people that work out in the field. If there's not restrooms available, it can become very difficult. Your 24-hour locations, you don't have to worry about if there is a restroom available, a lab open. It can be done right there with the supervisor, anywhere at any time, and that's what I really like about it.
Something else to think about is, Bill, you were saying that, some companies, they'll do one test maybe, they don't do any random test. I asked them, well, why do you do that? Why do you do one test, you never do any random test? Well, it's that time loss, it's the wages, they pass the test, so why would they be using? And I'm like, well, would you think that they might not be using? It's just like, I equate it to maybe the first day at school. Is one on their best behavior? Yes, they are. Give it a couple of weeks, a month, maybe in that quarter, a 3-month quarter, and, they think no one's watching them, they're blending in, and then they start maybe doing those drugs, or maybe they've been doing those drugs. So if you implement an easy, random drug test for your employees, and know up front that they can be tested at any time, you're just, keeping the employees on the, as you said, the straight and narrow. They're going to walk that line if they know that they're going to be doing those tests.
It's interesting, you had mentioned that every now and then you run into an employer who says, if I did random testing, I wouldn't have any employees at all. And whenever I hear that, I always think, well, if you did random testing, you wouldn't have any drug-using employees. What do you say, though? Now, for example, with random drug testing, obviously you're trying to help an employer make a decision that's actually going to increase the amount of drug tests that he or she does with their company. Let's say they're doing 100 pre-employment tests during the year because they're hiring a lot of people, and that's all they're doing, and you're going to them and suggesting that they actually do 50 more tests a year, so they're going to increase the cost of their drug testing bill for the year, if you want to put it that way, by 50%. So how do you position random drug testing to a client who's sort of reluctant to spend the money on it?
Well, one of the ways that we do that is, you brushed upon that subject a little bit, is, people who use drugs, they do cost the companies money, whether it's they're sick or maybe they're taking a product or there's some stealing or maybe embezzling, whatever it is, to fund their drug habit or to keep their habit going, whether it's staying home and being able to do it or doing it on the work site or taking from that company. So it's easier and more efficient if you stop it at the beginning and you're in control and they're not in control, because you can't be everywhere. You can't watch everything. You think you might have it under control, but you don't. So add that 50 more tests a year, and you're going to cut down on people taking from your company, and whether that's your time, vacation, property, any of those things right there. That's how some of the ways we've helped.
Now, when it comes to oral fluid testing, how does the cost of oral fluid testing compare to, say, urine or hair testing?
What we have found, and with what we charge, and we try to keep it as reasonable as possible, because we know with the economic times, a lot of companies are looking at the bottom dollar. We try to keep it as cost effective, and really with our oral drug test, it is either going to be the same, but we have found the same price, or we found that it's even it costs less. And with the price that we give them for a 10-panel oral fluid drug test, The cost includes the device, it includes all of your shipping, supplies, and your shipping fees. So they're not gonna have to pay for the drug test, then pay for shipping. It's all included at one low, affordable price. So, and, you know, you really can't beat that. And what I always tell clients when they say, well, but, you know, this is only costing us X amount for the urine, and I'm like, okay, well, how many diluted samples did you get back? Okay, well, we had to resend that client or that employee back to the lab, and I said, okay, then you have to look at, now you're paying for an additional urine test, so there's an additional cost. You're losing loss of production, so how much are you paying them per hour? So when they look at it at that perspective, it's like, oh, right, you're right, you know. We are spending more money because we're having to send them back again to take a urine test. Where with the oral fluid, it's one time, and we know it's not going to be diluted. It's observed, and the loss of production is cut in half because it's only 5 minutes, and they're still on the workplace where they're at, and they can take it, go right back out to the shop or out to the warehouse and continue work. So that's where it cuts down on their cost. And when you educate them on that part, it really makes them stop and think, and they see where they're saving the money.
One other thing, Bill, is I can tell you that one of the ways that we are going to help our clients or potential clients to realize how they can save money on those extra, let's say 50 tests you were saying, we're going to be using those slides on that, your return of investment slides. That was just a wonderful educational part of this webinar that I know can really show the people when they see hardcore numbers like that, to know that this is how money we could be saving or actually making at the end if we implement this. So that is one thing we're definitely going to do. And also, along with OraSure and doing these drug tests, see, something about Gallant is we do background checks for our clients, and we were streamlined with that, and we didn't have any problems with getting their background check searches back to them. We gave them a 24 to 72 hours, depending, you know, if there was any criminal records, so on and so forth. And so some of the clients that were very hesitant about doing drug tests, kept this in the same amount of time, a 24 to 72, depending, you know, if it's positive, a negative test, getting a hold of the applicant, the donor. So that has helped us retain our clients and give them more than what they had initially signed up with us for.
Yeah, the reason they like that is they can stay with one company and get everything instead of, you know, utilizing us, you know, for the background checks and then having to go somewhere else for the urine test. And a big part of it was the turnaround time. Some people were waiting 2 weeks to get results back when they were using a lab.
Okay. Now, let me ask you another question. Do you find employers will typically limit their random testing to safety-sensitive workers, or will they, you know, because I know you're in a state that allows random testing, so will random test everybody, or will they typically limit it to safety-sensitive workers?
All of our clients do on all of their employees,
okay,
across the board.
Okay. We have a question, and I'll go ahead and take a stab at this one. Bill, are there any states that prohibit random drug testing? And I mentioned that Stephanie and Carla are in a part of the country where random testing is permitted. There are a couple of states actually that prohibit random testing. Vermont does not allow random drug testing, and Rhode Island does not allow random drug testing. Also, in the city of city of San Francisco, random drug testing is prohibited within the city. That's not in California, although I would advise people generally that not because of statute, but because of case law, that random testing in California should be restricted to workers in safety-sensitive positions. And I think that's typically the practice in California. But in the city of San Francisco, random testing is not permitted. The same is true of the city of Boulder, Colorado, whereas Boulder, or Colorado, the state does not have a drug testing statute per se. The city of Boulder, Colorado does have a drug testing ordinance, and it does not allow random drug testing. Anyway, we've just reached the end of our time. I want to thank Stephanie and Carla for co-presenting with me today, for the excellent information that you provided. If you have any questions that we weren't able to get to, please feel free to contact OraSure at this number, or you can contact me directly as well. I'd be happy to respond to any questions that you had that we weren't able to get to, and I see there are some sitting here in the Q&A section that we weren't able to get to, but we will answer any questions that we weren't able to get to. Just let us know. We'll answer the ones that are here, and if you had another question, let us know, and we'll get to you. And with that, let me turn the microphone back over to Jessica.
Thank you. On behalf of OraSure Technologies, we hope you found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. Today's presentation is approved for 1 credit of continuing education for CSAPAS from SAPAC. Please email me, Jessica Polk, at jessica@billcurrent.com if you're interested in receiving or applying for those credits. I will email you a certificate of attendance. Again, you can email me, Jessica, at billcurrent.com. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.